everybody, and welcome to the Adult Chair on rashpixel.fm. I'm Pete Wright, and I am thrilled to be here mindfully with Michelle Chalfant. Hi, Michelle.
Hi, Pete.
How are you feeling? Feeling good? Feeling strong?
Feeling really strong today. How are you feeling?
I'm feeling really strong. My kung fu is strong, and it has to be because the eclipse is totally messing with me. As we record this, it's a little bit dated, but as we record this, the eclipse is coming toward me, and it's messing with me. I haven't slept. The internet's acting up. I blame the eclipse.
I do too. I mean, I really believe that it is the eclipse, so.
Terrible.
A lot of people not sleeping right now.
Truly.
And plus Mercury is in retrograde, so we got a lot of electronic issues, so it's all happening at once.
Throw it out the window.
Yes.
You know, we're talking about meditation and mindfulness today. We have a fantastic guest who's going to help us walk through this. Before we get started, head over to theadultchair.com to learn more about this show. You can subscribe for free by signing up to our mailing list or find it anywhere the finer podcasts are served with a quick search for The Adult Chair, and you can join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter. We would love to hear from you. Don't forget that private group. Private group on Facebook is fantastic and going strong. Thanks for all your contributions and vulnerability there. We sure appreciate your space in that space. Our guest today is Noah Levine. He is a Buddhist teacher and author of a number of fantastic books, including Dharma Punks, a memoir, The Heart of the Revolution, the Buddha's Radical Teachings on Forgiveness, Compassion, and Kindness, and his most recent, Refuge Recovery, a Buddhist Path to Recovering from Addiction. He's a counselor well equipped to teach us the foundations of what we're going to be talking about today. Noah, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, happy to be here.
I am thrilled because I was actually introduced to, I believe this is one of your programs, Against the Stream here in Nashville.
Yes, it is.
And I went to an intensive, I can't remember who led it, but it was someone from Against the Stream. It was at the Integrative Life Center here, probably 7 years ago or so. And the moment whoever it was started talking, I was like, and it wasn't you, but it was someone that looked sort of like you, I have to say. But the moment he started talking, within 10 minutes, I'm like, oh my God, I so resonate with this. And since that time, I've sent so many people over there, all of my clients, that anyone that struggles with any kind of addiction or that wants to learn more about meditation from the Buddhism perspective. So we're thrilled to have you here today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. I'm glad that you had that experience and got to connect with that community.
Yeah. Love it. So I would love to start out, because you have such an incredible journey on how you got here. Would you be willing to just share with us some of your journey, you know, how you came to be the person you are today and your journey from childhood till now?
Sure. I was born into a meditating family. My father, Stephen Levine, was a meditator. He was a teacher, an author. He, had focused his life on working with sort of meditative investigation on death and dying, working with Ram Dass, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And so I was born into, the kind of first generation of American kind of New Age spiritual Buddhist Hindu people, and was, around all of the kind of founders of what's become Western spirituality. And I had my own suffering. My parents were divorced, and my mom was, struggling with addiction, and my father was quite focused on his teaching. And I had my own kind of existential crisis, which became a suicidal ideation at a very young age. And I knew about death, and I knew about reincarnation. And I thought, like, man, I could just get out and start over from a very young age. And what happened for me was that then, that suffering, that angst, that confusion, I just started getting high. I started taking drugs and drinking alcohol, and it took the edge off of the pain that I was in, and I was self-medicating. And drugs and alcohol were a real solution for me for some time. And then they became an addiction and became a problem and became the not alleviating suffering so much as creating more suffering and consequences. And so by the time I was a teenager, I was in and out of jail, in and out of the juvenile prison system. And at 17 years old, sitting in juvenile hall, my third felony arrest, looking at doing some serious time in prison, my father said, why don't you try some mindfulness meditation? And I probably said something like, well, I need some real help, Dad, not your hippie meditation stuff. I need, like, how about a lawyer?
Let's start with some fundamentals, Dad.
I have a question, though. So
Sure.
from an early age, did your father ever teach you meditation? Like, had he offered that to you like when you were younger, or was this the first time?
Well, it was not the first time, and meditation was modeled, and I was around it, and I was at workshops and retreats, and so I knew about it, but it wasn't something that was forced. It wasn't something that was like, yes, and now we're going to Buddhist Sunday school, and you will meditate.
Okay.
It wasn't that kind of stuff.
Right.
So it was around, it was available. Certainly, like when I would get hurt when I was a kid, my dad would do like a guided meditation on softening around the pain rather than meeting it with aversion. So it was like stealthfully, mindfulness was modeled and it was integrated into how my father communicated with me, but it wasn't like sit down and pay attention to your breath. So this was really the first time I did a formal meditation. Mm-hmm. And I had a powerful experience for the I sat in my cell and tried to pay attention to my breathing and breathing out and counting the breath and just really trying to ignore my mind, which was the kind of main instruction, was pay attention to your breath and ignore your mind, because your mind is creating all of this suffering about the future and the past. So try to bring your full attention into the present. And it was so difficult. I wasn't able to do it very well, but even just the little bit that I was able to connect, that half a breath at a time that I could ignore my mind, I saw the utility of it. I saw, okay, this is a practical way to alleviate some of the suffering that I'm experiencing. And it gave me some hope and it gave me some inspiration. And I started to take meditation somewhat seriously. I ended up being locked up for several months, put into a group home till I turned 18 years old. And I would meditate some, and it was, I can remember back then feeling like, okay, it was the drugs and the alcohol were the problem. I need to be sober, and I got into recovery. And then I still had this delusion that maybe there's a material solution. If I could get the stuff, right, the relationship, the car. I had teenage material desires. I needed a motorcycle and a record collection and a leather jacket, and then I'd be happy.
Totally.
Right? Of course, those material desires increase for us as we age and get more a taste for like, well, if I had a Tesla, then I'd be happy.
Exactly.
Oh, man.
But I, so I started practicing at 17. And by the time I was 19, I started doing meditation retreats and took it very seriously all through my 20s, going to lots of retreats and, vows of celibacy and really intensive practice. And eventually my teachers asked me to begin teaching. And I started teaching. I started going back into the same juvenile hall that I'd been incarcerated in and giving mindfulness instructions to the kids that were locked up in there.
So what is the difference, in your opinion, between mindfulness and meditation?
Mindfulness is just one of the forms of meditation. I would break meditation into two general categories, although I think that there's probably more. But from a Buddhist perspective anyways, usually it's either a concentration technique or a mindfulness technique.
Gotcha.
Mindfulness being the technique that the Buddha practiced that led him to liberation. He said concentration, stuff like a mantra practice. He said that's a useful preliminary practice, but it won't end suffering. It will just allow you to kind of temporarily avoid it and feel good, but it won't uproot greed, hatred, and delusion, which are the causes of suffering. So mindfulness is turning towards, and concentration can be choosing to turn away from some things.
Well, one thing that really catches my mind is that when you said when you were a teenager, it didn't resonate with you as much, even let's say middle school or when you were freshman or sophomore in high school kind of thing. Because you really started this when you were, how old would you say, when you were in the cell? Like
I was
18?
17.
So in your opinion, because I know you've done this for a long time now, at what age can kids begin to learn this? and really have that same effect on them, or like a profound effect where maybe they don't have to turn to drugs and alcohol, or what's so prominent now is the vaping, and the drugs and the alcohol. I just see kids more and more and more, they're turning to these, and pills and all kinds of things. How can we, is it possible, I guess is my question, to even help them and introduce this kind of thing at a younger age and with a great effect on them?
Yeah. I think that the answer is yes. And,
Okay.
So you see sometimes, so in traditional Buddhism, the Buddha, was asked this question, and he said 7 years old.
Wow.
He said by the time someone's 7, they can start to grasp impermanence and mindfulness and, renunciation. What I see is like there's some great organizations that do teen retreats. And so you see teenagers really that are willing, kind of going to these retreats and turning towards meditation and mindfulness and community. So that definitely happens.
Mm-hmm.
And here's what I'll also say though, is that I actually believe that a lot of the addiction stuff
Mm-hmm.
is going to be predetermined by early childhood.
How so?
If a child has been traumatized in some way, if there's not a healthy connection with the primary caregivers, that or looking at it the other way, if there is a healthy connection with the parents, if there is isn't a kind of a trauma in the early childhood years from 1 to 5, then the experimentation with drugs and alcohol isn't going to become addiction.
Okay. So if there's a trauma, it's going to become more of an addiction versus...
It's like setting a high risk state, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Because, most teenagers, I think, are going to experiment, and it's going to be an experimentation that kind of goes, through college, and then they're going to go on with their lives and say, oh, yeah, I used to vape or whatever it was.
Right.
And then some of them are going to start vaping, and then they start smoking weed, and then they're going to start, taking pills and shooting heroin. And that's not, that's usually there's some predetermining factors around who's going to become an addict.
So I want to clear this up, because a lot of people ask this question too, because you have talked a lot about, obviously, Buddhism. So in your opinion, is Buddhism a philosophy or a religion?
Buddhism functions as religion for millions of people, right? You look at China, you look at Tibet, you look at Thailand, Burma, Sri Lanka. It is their religion. I don't know what the dictionary says about religion, but generally I think we tend to think of religion as a creation story, as it generally is a theistic philosophy about God created the earth and created human beings. Now, Buddhism doesn't speculate on creationism, and Buddhism is in that way much more a practical philosophy that just says, let's look at the human condition, what creates suffering for us, and how we can end suffering for ourselves. So it's a much more humanist. It's not a theistic religion. It's a non-theistic practical psychology that functions as a lot of people's religions. Now, I'll go ahead and get critical here and say that which is the Buddhist religion, much of it is in direct contradiction to what the Buddha actually taught.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
The Buddha was teaching a non-devotional, looking outside of yourself, all of this stuff about offering incense to statues. And, of course, that has nothing to do, although that's like core Buddhist religion, that has nothing to do with the Buddha's teachings.
Okay.
That's human beings turning the Buddha into a deity and worshiping the statue and worshiping the Buddha as a deity, almost as a god, rather than what he actually said was, he said, this is psychology. This is how our minds work. This is how craving creates suffering and how non-attachment ends suffering.
That's exactly how I see it. I see it more as a psychology or a philosophy or a way of living versus something I'm going to worship. And I look at the Buddha as just another amazing, masterful teacher that walked this the earth and showed us how to do this. So,
man, you just described it. It's just shocking me. I just got back from China not long ago. We went to Yingling Temple, the Temple of the Smiling Buddha, and these glorious 60-foot, statues, these gold statues of Buddha, and all of the incense being offered, and the fact that they charge admission and have a special hut for the high dollar donors. To get into this religious sanctuary. Talk about the impact of mankind's influence on Buddhism.
But of course, we could say the same thing about Jesus Christ and then the Christians and the Catholic Church and all of the terrible things that have been done in the name of Christ.
Right.
Right.
When, that are in direct contradiction to what the man was saying. Human beings tend to muck up everything.
Yeah.
So true.
Don't let us touch it.
You
had one job, mankind.
Money for it, and yes.
That's fascinating to me. And, when you come back to this idea of working with, and we'll say, teens who are in trouble, as you mentioned, you go back into the same juvenile facility where you were at the time and sort of looking at what the conditions are for being open to this stuff. I mean, if it didn't work for you coming from your family, and your background, looking at the conditions of what it actually takes to work for others, to actually be open to change and to figure out why is it that we let ourselves get into a space of such discontent, of such unhappiness, of such sorrow, and how do we find our way out of that darkness?
I think that part of what I love about Buddhism is that it normalizes the whole thing. It says, if you're suffering, like you said, that sorrow, that discontent, that's actually the status quo. Mm-hmm. That we're all born into a mind and body that craves for pleasure and doesn't have tolerance or compassion for pain, a mind and body that doesn't understand impermanence and change and loss. And the status quo of humanity is sort of being attached, therefore suffering, being aversive or angry or having hate towards pain, therefore creating oppression for ourselves and others. Mm-hmm. And that this path to awakening, the Buddha says, yes, that's normal, and it's possible to end suffering. We can actually, through our own efforts, through training our minds to be present, mindful, to see impermanence clearly, to learn compassion for pain, forgiveness of ourselves and others, we can do this radical path of awakening and break free from the normal sorrow of existence.
I watched this morning your Google talks at Google, and I was fascinated by you being there for a number of reasons. First of all, obviously you had a welcoming sort of audience, the subset of folks who are in the mindfulness community at Google. What I can't remember, it's Google Pause or whatever they call it there. I was fascinated by that on a conceptual level too. It feels like there is a real separation of church and state in terms of mindfulness practice, sort of spiritual practice, and the practical work that we do. We go to this job and we do this. We have this function that we work on, and yet so many people that we run into are driven to that very sorrow that we're talking about, the very darkness, by the work that they do, right? They're frustrated at their place of work. And yet we are taught not to acknowledge that, not to acknowledge the way our moods are impacting the work that we do. How do you approach that?
Well, it is interesting that, I want to reflect on the first part, the separation of church and state. And I think that that's one of the brilliant things that has happened with people in the West secularizing Buddhism, mindfulness, borrowing mindfulness from Buddhism and saying like, no, this isn't spiritual, this isn't Buddhism, this is right. This is medicine, this is psychology. And it's been done in such a brilliant way for so long that now we have millions of people practicing Buddhist meditation and they don't even know it. And it's like, oh no, this is something I learned from my healthcare provider. This is something I learned from my psychotherapist. And it's all comes from Buddhism. And so, at a place like Google where it's like, oh yeah, we have a mindfulness and it's a secular, we're not allowed to really talk about Buddhism. It's mindfulness. And so because mindfulness has been separated from Buddhism, then workplaces are like, oh yeah, we can totally, this helps our employees relax more, become more productive and less stressed out. And, as it turns out, self-care is actually good for production and for creativity. So my sense is that they have to go together, that we have to bring our present time awareness into whatever we're doing, and to increase our ability to function under stress and deadlines and everything that goes along with working in our modern corporate Western capitalist system.
And not run from it and numb it out. Instead, face it and sit squarely in it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
The healthiness of humanity does not begin and end between 8 and 6.
Well, I mean, in the Buddhist teachings on the Eightfold Path, he said, here's the 8 areas of your life or that are necessary for your happiness, and one of them is livelihood. He said, what you do for a living, how you relate to work, how you relate to money, your happiness or unhappiness is totally tied to your karma, right? So your relationship to money and work, and so part of that is like, you can't just meditate all the time and then do something for a living that is creating negative karma for you. You have to choose a livelihood that's wholesome and that's not causing harm to yourself or others.
Compare the rate of relapse with addictions if someone, let's say, enters Against the Stream. Actually, why don't you start out by letting people know what Against the Stream is? And I just want to compare that to just like a typical AA meeting or something like that, because he said some amazing things. I would love for you to share that.
Okay, I just need to clarify. So I have created, there's sort of 3 levels to the organizations that I've created. First was Dharma Punks. And Dharma Punks is a peer-led community where people get together and they meditate and they discuss Buddhism, and it's peer-led. Against the Stream is teacher-led, where there's actually empowered and trained Buddhist teachers where they can come and learn about Buddhism and practice Buddhism. Refuge Recovery is the aspect that I've created that's looking at using a mindfulness-based, a Buddhist-based treatment for addiction. Gotcha. So Against the Stream is for everyone, addicts and non-addicts, and Refuge Recovery is the specific for addicts.
And what I liked about that, I just want to also add this just for our listeners, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but I want to say whether you were or whether someone is codependent or a drug addict or an alcoholic or a binge eater, they all would go to Refuge Recovery. It's not just for drug addicts and alcoholics, correct? It's any kind of addiction.
All manifestations of addictions and affect of addiction. So yes, of course, family members are welcome. And however, my sense is that there's no real difference between the drug addict and the food addict and the sex addict, that addiction is the repetitive, reactive, response to craving and satisfying those cravings. And it's the outcome is suffering. It causes suffering when we've become addicted. Everyone has craving, not everyone has addiction. And so it's really looking at, like, if your craving has become addiction, however it's manifested, then this is the solution. It's hard to answer that last part of your question of like, what's the success rate versus the, kind of the traditional 12-step or refuge. Because these programs are anonymous, it's hard to study them.
Right.
It's hard to get good statistics on the 12-step programs. It's of success rates, and it's all kind of anecdotal. What I do know is that at this point, refuge recovery, there's meetings all over the country. There's hundreds of meetings. People are using it either in conjunction with the 12 steps or as a standalone. Many people are just doing refuge recovery as their full addiction treatment process. And what I know is that there are thousands of people that are using refuge recovery and are sober and are clean and are abstaining from the addictive behavior. And they're meditating and they're coming to the groups and they're doing the inventories and they're dedicating their life to wisdom and compassion to heal the addictions. And that really there's thousands and thousands of people that are using the refuge model. And it's hard to give statistics. I have anecdotes of people who have been sober for 10 years now using the Buddhist method, but we don't know the real numbers.
Or if someone wants to just learn about meditation in Buddhism, let's say, they can go to Against the Stream. But is Against the Stream in the same location as Refuge Recovery around the United States, or do you have as many locations of Against the Stream? Can you explain that?
Yeah, no. So Refuge Recovery, which are peer-led meetings, there's hundreds around the country, and people can find out about that on refugerecovery.org. They can look for meetings in their area. And then in Against the Stream, there are only a few places where there's actually Against the Stream groups. In Los Angeles, we have 2 centers. In San Francisco, we have 1 center. In Nashville, we have a center. In Boston, we have a center. In New York City, we have a center. There's some other affiliated Against the Stream groups around the country in Seattle and Austin. And so there are some other ones around, but the core centers that are really the teachers where I teach and where the teachers that I've trained are New York, San Francisco, Nashville, Los Angeles, and Boston.
Great. Okay.
You've, as we get to wrapping up here, I've got a possibly wildly unrelated question. We'll see. You've got some crazy, fantastic tattoos. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your relationship to body art and belief systems.
Sure. I'd say two things about that. One is I started getting tattooed in the 1980s to set myself apart from the white middle class that I am part of. Yeah, right. And to say, I'm not part of this white male system of oppression in this country. And I don't want to be identified as another normal straight white guy. And I started getting heavily tattooed to set myself apart. Of course, through the 90s, tattooing became so popular that it became so trendy that it became actually like a club you're fitting into rather than a symbol of. So I think that part of it was that. And then, of course, also acknowledging what a delusion that is, with all of the racial tension in our country and all of the ignorance that's happening, of me having to wake up and saying like, oh, actually, no matter how many tattoos I get, I'm still a white guy, and I still walk through this world with that white privilege. And I can't be in denial about that, no matter how critical I am. I need to wake up to my privilege and to be an ally and not to pretend like I'm not part of that, white male experience, and that it's not the same as my friends who are people of color. I have a totally different experience walking through this world than they do. And, to really dedicate to being an ally, no matter how many tattoos I have. My, the other piece that I'll say is that almost pretty much all of my tattoos are of spiritual symbology, of things that remind me of my own intentions about kindness and compassion, about wisdom and forgiveness. And so, I'm covered in tattoos of Buddhas.
It's amazing work. I assume you have a relationship with someone you trust to do all this work, or is it just with you just go when the spirit moves you?
I got most of my tattoos. My body's pretty much covered, and I did most of it in the 90s. Yeah. And I was fortunate to be in San Francisco, where a lot of the best tattooers at the time were. Yeah. And so I've got some of the best tattoos from the 1990s. And tattooing has gone to a whole nother level. And I have to admit that, like, I would love to start over, because there's guys, men and women tattooing now that kind of just have a skill and an ability to do a kind of tattoo work that nobody even knew about 20 years ago.
Sure.
So, like, tattooing has gone to a whole nother level.
That's fantastic. That was not an answer I expected, but I am delighted that you shared it here. Thank you so much for your.
Well, I feel like, no matter what we're talking about these days, it's important to also address all of the confusion and oppression and racism that's happening in this world. And, to really kind of say, like, we have to see this, we have to break the denial about this, and we have to, find some ways to speak out and to respond. And, so I always want to integrate that into whenever I'm talking. I'm talking about addiction recovery, but part of addiction recovery and part of mindfulness and part of spiritual practice is compassionate action. And addressing the ignorance in our society is a compassionate act.
I can't think of a better way to wrap us up here. Thank you so much for
sharing
that
was beautiful.
Insights. That is just lovely. I'm going to put links to all of these great resources that you have mentioned on the show in our show notes. Anything in particular you have going on you want to share with folks? Any events that we need to make special note of?
Well, if people get motivated and they want to set a meditation retreat, that information will be on againstthestream.org. We have a week-long retreat in October in Joshua Tree in the desert. I think I'm going to do a retreat in Thailand this December, if anybody wants to make the trek over to Thailand. People who are seeking addiction recovery and want to check out the meetings, that's at refugerecovery.org. And then if they're seeking professional treatment, if people need rehabilitation treatment services, I have a detox treatment center, sober living, the whole thing in Los Angeles, Refuge Recovery Treatment Centers.com. Wow. And so if people are looking for professional treatment, I have that as well. It's one of the things. Is
that for men and women?
For men and women, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That is wonderful stuff. We'll put links to all of that in the show notes. Just swipe over to the show notes. You'll see all of those links. You can jump to them right there on your handy mobile device. Thank you so much. No, on behalf of Michelle Chalfant and Noah Levine, thank you so much for your time and attention today. Everybody, we certainly appreciate you taking the time to download and listen to this show. Until next time, where we will find you sitting right here, firmly in the adult chair.